In the winter of 1987, a quiet residential neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing crime scenes ever uncovered in American history. Behind the doors of an ordinary row house lived Gary Michael Heidnik, a man who, to the outside world, appeared reclusive but harmless. Few could have imagined that beneath his home, in a dark basement pit, unimaginable suffering was taking place. Over the course of several months, 6 women were lured inside that house under false promises of money or help. Once inside, they were chained, beaten, raped, starved, and tortured. 2 of them, Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley, would never leave alive. What authorities would later uncover shocked even veteran investigators. A self-made dungeon, human remains, and survivors so traumatized they could barely speak. The crimes were so brutal, so calculated, that they forced the nation to confront a chilling question. How could a man with a long history of mental illness commit acts of such deliberate cruelty? And perhaps even more unsettling, how could that same man later insist he was sane enough to die? Gary Heidnik will be convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. Sentenced to death, he shocked many by refusing to fight his execution. While his family and legal advocates argued he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, Heidnik himself wanted no appeals. He wanted to die. On July 6, 1999, after more than a decade on death row, Heidnik walked into the execution chamber at SCI Rockview. His final meal was simple: 2 slices of cheese pizza and black coffee. And when asked if he had any last words, the man responsible for one of America's most horrifying captivity crimes said nothing at all. He was pronounced dead at 10:29 p.m., becoming the last person executed in the state of Pennsylvania. To understand how an outwardly ordinary man became the architect of a living nightmare, and how justice ultimately caught up with him, we have to go back to the beginning. But before we do, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is not just a story about a killer. It's a story about survival, suffering, and a system forced to decide where justice ends and madness begins. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November 22, 1943, in Eastlake, Ohio, into a childhood defined not by stability or care, but by abandonment, neglect, and violence. His mother left when he was still young, walking away from the family entirely, while his father, cold, domineering, and physically abusive, ruled the household with fear. Friends and relatives would later describe a boy who was withdrawn, awkward, and deeply isolated, struggling to connect in a world that offered him little compassion and no sense of belonging. As Gary grew older, the damage beneath the surface became harder to ignore. He began exhibiting signs of severe mental illness, paranoia, delusions, and distorted thinking that separated him further from reality. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a lifelong condition that would haunt every stage of his adulthood. Over the years, Heidnik would be committed multiple times to psychiatric institutions, sometimes voluntarily, other times by court order, after episodes that raised serious concerns about his grasp on reality. In the early 1960s, in what may have been an attempt to impose structure on a fractured mind, Heidnik enlisted in the United States Navy during the Vietnam era. But the military environment only exposed what doctors already feared. His mental instability made service impossible, and he was medically discharged after a short period, officially deemed unfit due to mental illness. It was another rejection, another confirmation that he did not belong. Eventually, Heidnik drifted east and settled in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he lived alone in a modest row house. To neighbors, he appeared strange but harmless, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, attended church sporadically, and rarely drew attention. But behind that unassuming exterior, something deeply unsettling was taking shape. In a development that would later baffle psychologists and prosecutors alike, Gary Heidnik began investing in the stock market, and he was extraordinarily successful. Through careful, disciplined trading, he amassed hundreds of thousands of dollars, building a small fortune that stood in stark contrast to his documented psychiatric history. To the legal system, This financial success became proof of competence. To experts, it raised troubling questions. Because while Heidnik could analyze markets, manage risk, and grow wealth, his mind remained trapped in a distorted inner world, one fueled by grandiose delusions, misogyny, and a growing belief that he was chosen for something greater, something darker. To the outside world, Gary Michael Heidnik appeared functional, even intelligent, disciplined, and capable of long-term planning. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, a dangerous delusion was forming, quietly evolving into the nightmare that would soon unfold beneath his own home. Before the chains, before the basement, before the headlines, these women were living ordinary lives, fragile perhaps, complicated certainly, but deeply human. They were not born into darkness. They were pushed toward it by poverty, instability, and a society that too often looked away. Josefina Rivera, a young woman struggling to survive on the margins, carried both resilience and vulnerability. She trusted easily, hoping for kindness in a city that rarely offered it. Her courage would later save lives, including her own, but at the time, she was simply trying to get through another day. Sandra Lindsay, remembered as gentle and quiet, had dreams that extended far beyond the streets she walked. She longed for stability, for dignity, for a chance to be seen as more than her circumstances. Instead, she would become one of the two women who never made it out alive. Deborah Dudley, fiercely independent and determined, was navigating hardship with strength that would later be turned against her. Her trust was exploited, her humanity stripped away, and her life brutally taken in an act so cruel it still chills investigators decades later. Lisa Thomas was vulnerable in ways few could see at first glance. Her struggles made her an easy target for someone who knew how to manipulate kindness and desperation. Yet through unimaginable suffering, she survived, a testament to endurance in the face of pure cruelty. Agnes Adams lived with her own challenges, including cognitive limitations that left her especially exposed to exploitation. She depended on the goodwill of others, never imagining that the help she was promised would become a nightmare of captivity and terror. Jacqueline Askins, like the others, was trying to survive in a world that offered little protection. She trusted a stranger who spoke softly and promised money, not knowing that the door she walked through would lock behind her. What bound these women together was not weakness, but economic vulnerability, lives shaped by limited options, by the constant search for safety, shelter, and opportunity. Gary Heidnik recognized that vulnerability and exploited it with chilling precision, offering small sums of money, a place to stay, or simple help, just enough to earn trust, just enough to close the trap. They were not reckless. They were not careless. They were human. They were not statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and survivors, until one man decided they were property and turned their search for help into a descent into unimaginable horror. In the closing months of 1986 and continuing into early 1987, Gary Michael Heidnik began putting his darkest fantasies into action. By night, he cruised the streets of Philadelphia, carefully selecting women who appeared alone, vulnerable, and in need. His approach was calm, almost polite. He offered conversation. He offered money. Sometimes he offered help. And in a city where survival often depended on taking chances, those offers did not immediately raise alarm. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. A ride, a short drive, a promise that sounded reasonable enough to believe. And then, the house. Once inside, the tone shifted. The door closed, locks engaged, and freedom vanished. According to court records and survivor testimony, the women were restrained almost immediately. Hands and feet shackled, bodies forced into submission before panic could turn into resistance. Heidnik had prepared for this moment meticulously. His basement had been transformed into a place of confinement, a hidden pit dug into the floor, lined with filth and darkness, designed not just to imprison, but to dehumanize. One by one, the women were lowered into that pit, chained to pipes or walls, stripped of autonomy and identity. From that moment forward, time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights as physical and sexual torture began, carried out systematically, without mercy and without urgency, as if suffering itself were the goal. Court documents detail the horrors that followed. Heavy shackles cutting into skin, limiting movement until muscles weakened and joints screamed in pain. Starvation, used as a weapon, with food rationed or withheld entirely to enforce obedience. Beatings, delivered without warning, sometimes for perceived disobedience, sometimes for nothing at all. And most disturbingly, electrical torture, wires attached to the women's bodies, current sent through them while Heidnik watched, controlled, and decided when the pain would stop. But the physical abuse was only part of the control. Heidnik employed relentless psychological manipulation, turning victims against one another, forcing them to participate in acts they would carry with them forever, convincing them that escape was impossible and rescue would never come. He positioned himself as both captor and god, the sole authority over pain, food, light, and survival. This was not chaos. This was not impulse. It was a calculated system of domination, constructed over weeks and months, hidden beneath a normal-looking home in a quiet neighborhood. And while the city above went on with its daily life, buses running, neighbors passing by, lights turning off at night, beneath that house, 6 women were being erased piece by piece, trapped in a nightmare that showed no sign of ending. Beneath the house on Marshall Street, the basement became something far worse than a prison. It became a world entirely controlled by one man. The women were forced to live inside a pit dug into the floor, cramped, filthy, and lightless, chained in positions that made even rest an act of pain. Days passed without sunlight. Nights passed without silence. The pit was not designed for survival. It was designed for submission. Gary Heidnik dictated every aspect of existence. Food was power, and he used it deliberately, rationing scraps or withholding meals altogether to break resistance. Light was a privilege, switched on or off at his discretion. Movement was punishment, permitted only when he allowed it, and always at a cost. The women learned quickly that survival depended not on escape, but on anticipating his moods. As the abuse escalated, so did the psychological terror. Heidnik deliberately turned the victims against one another, forcing impossible choices and creating an environment where guilt became as inescapable as the chains. Cooperation was demanded. Disobedience was punished. And trust, the one thing that might have offered comfort, was systematically destroyed. The horror reached an unthinkable level after the first death. Sandra Lindsay, already weakened by relentless beatings, starvation, and neglect, could no longer endure the abuse. She died in the basement pit, not quickly and not mercifully, but as the inevitable result of prolonged torture. Her death did not bring relief. Instead, it marked a turning point. According to court testimony, Heidnik dismembered Sandra's body and forced the surviving women to consume portions of her remains, using starvation and fear to ensure compliance. It was an act meant not only to shock, but to erase boundaries, to bind the victims to their captivity through trauma so severe it felt impossible to ever speak of, let alone escape from. Then came the second murder. Deborah Dudley was subjected to one of the most disturbing acts described in the trial. Heidnik rigged electrical wires to her body and, in a final assertion of control, forced another captive woman to flip the switch, delivering the fatal current. Deborah was electrocuted in the basement while the others watched, powerless, knowing that refusal could mean death for themselves. The survivors would later testify that this moment shattered any remaining illusion of humanity within their captor. The violence was no longer just inflicted by him. It was weaponized through them, turning victims into unwilling participants in unimaginable acts. This was not impulsive violence. It was not rage. It was calculated cruelty, carried out methodically, with planning, patience, and intent. A system of suffering designed to dominate bodies, minds, and souls, hidden in silence beneath an ordinary Philadelphia home, while the world above remained unaware. After months of unimaginable suffering, A glimmer of hope emerged when Josefina Rivera, one of the captive women, found the courage and opportunity to escape. Even while badly injured, weakened by starvation, bruised, and battered from the relentless abuse she had endured in the basement pit. Bloodied, trembling, and exhausted, she ran through the streets at first light, every step an act of desperation and defiance. Reaching a nearby home, she knocked on doors and pleaded for help, her voice carrying the terror and urgency of someone who had lived through unthinkable horrors. Her cries were answered, and the police were summoned immediately, officers rushing to the scene as adrenaline surged through the morning air. By March 24, 1987, law enforcement had descended on the quiet Philadelphia row house and made a discovery that would horrify even seasoned investigators. Beneath the floorboards of the basement lay a pit constructed for captivity, walls lined with filth, chains bolted to the concrete, and the remnants of human suffering. Human remains, meager scraps of survival, and the evidence of relentless abuse. Inside that confined space, the starving, terrified women who had not yet escaped were rescued, shaking, disoriented, and unable at first to comprehend that freedom had returned. Chains were removed, bodies lifted from the pit, and medical personnel began the painstaking process of treating wounds, dehydration, and shock. Every officer and witness who entered that basement felt the weight of the crimes committed there. The cruelty, the meticulous control, and the unimaginable psychological torment inflicted by a man who had held human lives in the palm of his hand. It was a moment of horror transformed into salvation, a day that would mark the end of Heidnik's reign of terror. But the full story of his depravity was only beginning to come to light, documented in court testimony, police reports, and survivor recollections that would haunt Philadelphia and the nation for years to come. Following the harrowing discovery of the basement and the rescue of the surviving women, Gary Michael Heidnik was taken into custody without resistance, quietly led from his home as police documented every horrifying detail he had left behind. From the outset, his legal defense centered on the claim of insanity, with his attorneys arguing that his long-standing paranoid schizophrenia had rendered him incapable of understanding the full consequences of his actions. Psychiatric evaluations were presented, documenting years of delusions, hospitalizations, and behavioral abnormalities, suggesting that Heidnik's mind had long straddled the line between reality and fantasy. But the prosecution painted a very different picture, arguing with methodical precision that, despite his mental illness, Heidnik had demonstrated a capacity for planning, manipulation, and foresight that made him fully aware of his crimes. Witnesses and evidence showed that he had carefully lured women to his home, prepared a hidden dungeon, controlled their food and movement, and inflicted torture in ways that required deliberate calculation, not impulsive behavior. As the lead prosecutor famously stated in court, he knew exactly what he was doing. After a trial that gripped the nation with its shocking revelations, the jury returned a verdict that reflected the severity and premeditation of Heidnik's crimes. He was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, alongside multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and torture, all supported by exhaustive survivor testimony, police evidence, and forensic documentation. The court sentenced him to death in 1988, a punishment meant to match the horror of the crimes, and to serve as a grim acknowledgement of the lives lost and the trauma inflicted on the women who had survived. From a moment of arrest to the final verdict, the case forced the nation to confront difficult questions about mental illness, legal responsibility, and the limits of justice, setting the stage for a decade-long journey toward the ultimate reckoning with a man whose actions had left an indelible mark on American criminal history. After his conviction and death sentence, Gary Michael Heidnik was transferred to Pennsylvania's death row, a place of isolation, regimentation, and stark silence where the weight of his crimes followed him every day. Unlike many condemned inmates, he made an unusual and chilling choice. He refused to pursue appeals, declining the legal maneuvers that might have delayed his execution indefinitely, signaling a willingness to confront death on his own terms. This decision immediately sparked a fierce legal battle, as his family and advocates attempted to intervene, arguing that his long-documented paranoid schizophrenia rendered him mentally incompetent to waive appeals and, by extension, to understand the full consequences of his execution. Lawyers filed motions, psychiatric experts submitted detailed evaluations, and courts were asked to determine whether a mind plagued by delusions could truly consent to its own death. Despite the compelling evidence of his mental illness, the courts ultimately ruled that Heidnik was legally competent, citing his ability to manage finances, communicate coherently, and make deliberate decisions over the years as proof that he understood his situation and the consequences of refusing appeals. Pennsylvania's legal system moved forward, clearing the way for his execution to be carried out without further delay, setting in motion the final chapter of a case that had captivated and horrified the nation. The debate surrounding Heidnik's mental state raised an unsettling and philosophical question for both the justice system and the public at large. Can a man be profoundly mentally ill, trapped in delusions and psychosis, and still choose death, fully aware of what that choice means? It was a question that cast a long shadow over the proceedings, forcing a reckoning not just with the crimes he committed, but with the limits of law, sanity, and human responsibility. The culmination of years of investigation, trial, and legal wrangling arrived on July 6, 1999, when Gary Michael Heidnik faced the final moments of his life at the State Correctional Institution, Rockview in Pennsylvania, a facility designed to carry out the ultimate sentence of the state. In accordance with protocol, he was offered a last meal, a final gesture of tradition that he accepted simply and plainly: 2 slices of cheese pizza and a black coffee, modest in comparison to the magnitude of the crimes he had committed. Witnesses observed him enter the execution chamber with a measured, detached demeanor, giving no indication of fear or remorse. When the prison officials asked if he wished to speak any last words, Heidnik declined entirely, offering silence where others might have spoken, leaving only the weight of his actions and their consequences to resonate in the room. At precisely 10:29 p.m., Gary Michael Heidnik was pronounced dead, his life formally ended by the state's lethal injection protocol. His death marked a historical moment, as he became the last person to be executed in Pennsylvania in the modern death penalty era, closing a chapter of one of the most horrific and meticulously documented criminal cases in American history. The room emptied, the gates secured, and the echoes of the basement horrors he had orchestrated remained long after the final act of justice had been carried out, leaving survivors, investigators, and a nation to grapple with the legacy of a man whose intelligence, delusion, and cruelty had forever altered countless lives. As the screen faded from the stark reality of the execution chamber to the soft glow of candlelight, it becomes clear that this story is not simply about the death of a man, but about the profound suffering endured by 6 women who were trapped, terrorized, and in some cases murdered by a man whose actions were meticulously calculated and horrifying in their cruelty. It is the story of survivors who, against all odds, endured the unthinkable and carried the weight of trauma forward, and of a justice system that struggled and continues to struggle to reconcile the questions of sanity, responsibility, and the limits of punishment in a case that tested the very boundaries of law, ethics, and human understanding. We invite you to reflect deeply on this story. What does justice truly mean in cases like this, where the perpetrator is both profoundly mentally ill and extraordinarily dangerous? Should mental illness alter the way society punishes, or should it serve only to explain the crime without mitigating accountability? Share your thoughts, opinions, and reflections in the comments below. And if you found this documentary both important and illuminating, subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell to ensure you never miss another true story that must be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Because these are not just stories of crime. They're stories of human resilience, the consequences of evil, and the ongoing quest for justice.